What do you have a sense as you look at like the implications of all this that will have what at this point will have the most the sort of the greatest impact and perhaps sort of like cause a policy response? Like as I see this stuff in Florida with the fifth major insurer is planning to leave the state. I guess they got to give 90 days notice or something to that effect. Um, at one point, like this is going to become not just tangible, like tangible twice over, right? I mean, it's one thing to see, that it's flooding, but it's another all of a sudden to like see like, oh, the people who are betting on this stuff have decided this is a bad bet.
I think that for the whole combination of reasons, the next 18 months is going to be the crucial period. We're right at the beginning of an El Nino warming period in the Pacific. That'll be enough to keep driving already record high temperatures ever higher for the next 18 months or so anyway. And that'll produce violent chaos and havoc in our climate system. We don't know exactly what forms it will take and where it exactly will manifest, but we can count on the fact that it's going to, and in ways that no human has ever seen before. This coincides with the moment when we're also starting to finally see the playing out of the first sort of round of semi-solutions to this crisis. We're finally starting to see renewable energy at scale. The thing that kept Texas together the last 6 weeks in this horrific heat wave, kept the grid from crashing, was the fact that they had a lot of solar on it. So there's things that are going to be cross-cutting. I think that this will be the last big wake-up call that we get in a period that's still relevant to the outcome, when we still are going to be able to do things that will really affect how high the temperature eventually gets. So I think the politics of this have to be supercharged for the next 18 months. And I don't know quite what forms that will take, but we're going to have to try and build movements on as mass a scale as we can to pressure for as much quick change as we can, because right at the moment, we're clearly behind and getting a little further behind.
I want to just dwell on that point because I think you wrote in that New Yorker piece that this is a hinge moment, and so and certainly I feel like over the past couple of months there's been more pieces where you read scientists saying this is actually playing out worse than we had thought, or we have crossed some type of precipice, and I mean, what's the best metaphor for that? Because it feels to me like we're at, there's a big boulder at the top of a hill, and it's just getting to the point where it's being pushed that it rolls down the hill, and there's nothing that's going to stop it if we don't keep it from that ledge.
Yeah, well, that's a perfectly good metaphor, and we're clearly right near that moment. We don't know whether we've crossed over it yet. The best science indicates that we may have. The IPCC told us that if we cut emissions in half by 2030, we had some chance of keeping on the pathway that we set out at Paris just 8 years ago. 2030, by my watch, is 6 years and 5 months away. That doesn't give us a lot of time. And that's why I say I think we're going to get one last big push here. And some of that push is going to come from Mother Nature, but we're going to have to respond to that and back it up with a big push from civil society in as many parts of the world as we can.
I'm curious about your best guess, and I'm kind of channeling the shock doctrine here, for what some industries are going to do to capitalize on the coming chaos, the migration, the insecurity for water and food as it comes. What are some of the things that you could anticipate in terms of exploitation of the fallout from the crises to come?
Well, I'm sure there'll be plenty of that. And Naomi will, and the rest of us will keep track as best we can. But I think in the short run, the real example of that is the fact that the fossil fuel industry is doing everything it can to kind of co-opt the effort to cut emissions. So they got a lot of money stuck in the IRA by Joe Manchin for these, carbon sequestration schemes and things like that. Stuff that is expensive and not particularly helpful, and really meets their goal of slowing down what has to happen. And what has to happen, because it's what we have, because it's what's affordable, is solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. Those are the trinity of things that, if applied at large enough scale, might begin to shift the underlying dynamics of the planet's climate system. I have no doubt, Emma, that as things flood and whatever else, there'll be all kinds of people figuring out how to take rotten advantage of it all. But the basic job remains: transform our energy system, and do it in ways that hopefully in the process will at least somewhat strengthen communities. One of the good things about sun and wind is that they're available, unlike coal and oil and gas, everywhere. And that's a help.
I mean, it does feel like there is an understanding in that fossil fuel industry that they're ultimately going to lose this battle, and they're just basically squeezing every single dollar they can.
Carbon capture and stuff like that, right? So they can keep doing what they need in the short term.
They can keep burning. They've got, by the latest, I haven't checked the price of oil in the last couple of weeks, but in their reserves of fossil fuel, this industry has someplace between $50 and $100 trillion worth of hydrocarbons that they've cataloged, that they have in deposits below the ground, that they want to dig up and sell. And if we take climate change seriously, that $50 trillion stays underground. That's the stakes. That's why they fight so hard. That's why it's well worth purchasing political parties and so on.
How much do you, in terms of where we are at this point, and from as a political matter, and I guess getting back to that question of sort of democracy and how the failures of democracy inhibit our ability to stop those interests. How much of this ends up becoming, and I feel like there's always been, I think, a significant amount of writing to this effect. And I just read a piece in Jacobin about research that has shown that there is a real class war element to this. I mean, and it's obvious in the sense that as the wealthiest country on the planet, we have created far more climate change, as it were. I mean, ultimately, than those less wealthy countries that are going to pay the price even more so. But even within the context of these societies, how much of a class war and an understanding of this being driven by the rich and wealthy interests, how helpful do you perceive that as an understanding or as a strategy?
Well, I mean, first place, the grotesque inequalities of our society are probably the biggest reason why our democracy is so weak and unable to respond to the challenges like this that you would hope it would. And it's certainly true that rich people use more carbon than poor people on average. It's also true that almost all Americans have figured out ways to use large amounts of carbon compared to the rest of the world. So you're right to stick it in a global context too, and understand that there are all kinds of inequities here. The good news, if there is good news, is that there are a lot of things, a lot of technological answers at this point that are going to be helpful for everyone if we can get them deployed. So say a heat pump, which is the necessary technology for getting much more efficient heating and cooling. It's also much better for the people who have them in their homes. They're cheaper to operate. You don't have the boom bust pricing cycle that you do for oil, on and on and on. Electric vehicles are a great idea because of their help with the climate, and e-bikes best of all. But they're also useful because, 9 million people a year on this planet die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That's 1 death in 5. In this country, it manifests in hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma a year. And they're obviously concentrated in, poor and vulnerable communities, because that's who gets to live next to refineries and next to highways and so on and so forth. So this is the biggest single challenge that our civilizations have yet faced. Can we quickly change our ways of powering our lives in time to avert a pretty much existential catastrophe? And we don't know the answer to that. We know that left to its own devices, the system won't go fast enough, that inertia and vested interest will keep it from responding nimbly. What we're going to have to try and find out is if we can goose that system, continue to goose that system in ever larger ways with ever more mass movement. That's what it takes. The first Earth Day in 1970 saw 20 million Americans in the street. That was about 10% of the then population of the US. I'd wager that if we could get 10% of the population of the US out in the street, that would probably change the political dynamic here enough to allow us to make considerably faster progress than we're making at the moment. And the same around the world. Do I know how to get that many people out in the street? I don't. We helped organize what have been the biggest demonstrations yet about climate change. 400,000 people in New York in 2014. We helped provide a lot of the logistics work when there were millions of young people out around the world in September of 2019 on school strike and things. But if you ask me, that's what it's going to continue to take, because our system is not yet exerting anything like maximum effort to deal with this crisis.
Bill McKibben, folks can check out thirdact.org for more information, and I really appreciate your time, and
absolutely.
And stay
Emma,
safe up
Sam, thank you for keeping eyes on this crisis and on everything else. On we go.
Yes.
Thanks, Bill.
All right.
Stay
Stay safe.
safe. Yeah.